Welcome, everybody. It's great to see everyone here in our return to live Cyber Policy Center workshops, which will be meeting every Tuesday at noon. We've got a great lineup for this term, and we've got a great initial speaker today. We are trying something new this time, since we haven't been meeting live for almost 2 years. But we developed such a large Zoom audience that we didn't want to cut out the rest of the world's population who's interested in our seminars. So we're doing a combination of Zoom and live for these seminars, and in this great room here in Encina Commons. I should say, I'm Nate personally. I'm head of the Cyber Policy Center. I'm also a law professor here at Stanford, and also a professor in communication, political science, all kinds of other departments. And the Cyber Policy Center lunch series features folks from industry, folks from academia, folks from government, our own postdocs here in the Cyber Policy Center, all to talk about issues at the intersection of speech, democracy, and technology. We have 6 programs in the Cyber Policy Center. Stanford Internet Observatory, the Program in Democracy and Internet, the Global Digital Policy Incubator, the Social Media Lab, the Program on Geopolitics, Technology, and Governance, and the Program on Platform Regulations. So all of these programs are going to be having events and seminars and other opportunities for you to get involved throughout the term. So we're really excited to finally kick everything off this term. And as I said, we couldn't be happier that our first speaker is Katie Harbaugh. I actually met Katie Harbaugh, I think almost, 6, 7 years right after the 2016 election, where we had our first kind of probe event for the Program on Democracy and Internet here at Stanford, where we invited the Federal Election Commission to come in 2013, actually, to Stanford, to start talking about how the internet and digital communication technologies were changing campaigning. And those discussions really led to some of the work we now do here at the Cyber Policy Center. And so at the time, Katie was a public policy director at Facebook, really running so much of the work that Facebook was doing on elections. She left Facebook within the last 2 years or so, and is now CEO of Encrypted, but also has so many affiliations it's hard to count. She works with the International Republican Institute. She's now a fellow at the McCourt Center for Public Policy at Georgetown, and also has a great Substack that I encourage everybody to sign up for, anchorchange.substack.com.
Yep.
And so there's no one better to talk about elections and social media than Katie Harbaugh. And so we're really thrilled to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nate, for inviting me. I was going to say, I think it's 10 years since we first met almost, which is crazy of how much has happened since then. So like Nate said, I want to talk about where we are today in terms of the social media platforms and their policies and how they're looking, not only going into the 22 midterm elections, but there's actually a lot of international elections that have been happening and will be happening. Italy just happened most recently, and then Brazil is actually going to be here on Sunday, which is one that I'm keeping a really close eye on. But first, I want to kind of set the stage of how we got to this point, because I think I've been doing a lot of research recently, going back over the last 26 years actually, of looking at how tech has impacted elections. In fact, potentially as I'm speaking here, it might go live, we'll see, but with the Bipartisan Policy Center, one of my other many affiliations, I am publishing a report looking at it. I'm calling it a brief history of tech and elections over the last 26 years. We start in 1996 and we go to today, and I'll walk through some of that today as well. But as we all know, today in the world, democracy is in a really tough place. In the last 10 years, we have lost 30 years of democracy building. Since we've not been at this low of a level since coming out of the Cold War in the late 80s. Dictatorships are on the rise, and we've seen 35 countries have significant deteriorations in freedom of expression in their countries, increased from only 5 countries 10 years ago. These charts is from VDEM. If any of you are familiar with them, they're one of the leading democracy measurement organizations there. And a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is trying to think about what really happened in these last 10 years and how can we try to reverse this? And how can we try to think about it and have a new approach to what does it mean to build democracy and what is technology's role in terms of doing that? I graduated UW-Madison in 2003. I moved out to Washington, D.C., and my first job was at the Republican National Committee, where as I was coming into that role, the guys who were running President Bush's web stuff were going to his campaign, and I wrote this memo for my boss of all this stuff I thought we should be doing online. It was called the E-campaign back then. We didn't even have official digital channels. Back then, it was candidates having websites was a novelty. The Dole-Clinton race of 1996, if you go back and look, it's all about how novel it is that they've built websites and that they're using the World Wide Web in order to engage with voters and citizens. 2000 election, people had websites again. You were starting to see some online fundraising, stuff like that. But that 2004 race that I worked on was one of the first where you really saw you had Howard Dean, who is using Meetup and the internet to do fundraising, to gather voters together, using video in a really cool and different way. But remember, during this 2004 timeframe, Facebook had just been created in February of that year. YouTube didn't exist yet. Instagram didn't exist. Twitter didn't exist. TikTok didn't exist. None of these things existed. And coming out of that election through pretty much 2015, I call it the optimistic timeframe of how we thought that technology was going to improve democracy. We thought, like, the goal was we thought, how awesome will it be if someday the President of the United States is talking directly to voters using social media? We thought that that was going to be a good thing. We wanted that. We thought that small dollar fundraising was going to help to democratize and help get rid of big money. And it did that, but it's also had other unintended consequences. I would say the peak was the 2011, 2012 time period when you had the Arab Spring that happened. And you also had President Obama's win in 2012. We're coming out of that 2012 election. That was when, as Nate mentioned, I was at Facebook. I was mainly working on US stuff during 2012. Going into 2013, we had so many candidates and political parties around the world coming to us being like, how do we do what Barack Obama did? And so we wanted to start building out that team internationally to work with those politicians on using it. It's also a little painful to say right now, but in 2012, Google and YouTube were, and I'll show you a graph on this, were a bit more dominant in terms of the platforms and stuff that folks were using. And we really wanted 2016 to be known as the Facebook election, which we did, but not in the way that I was intending for it to be. Which leads me into the reckoning phase. And by the way, I came up with these phases and time frames and all that. So May 9th, 2016. Most of you probably don't remember what you were doing that day or why that might be a really big day. That is a day I will never, ever forget, and I think is a turning point. It was the start of the turning point of people starting to realize the downsides of technology when it came to elections and democracy. That was the date of the Philippines election, when Rodrigo Duterte won. I was in Manila, I was in the Philippines. I was about to go do my last TV hit because by this point in time, we were doing live streams with news partners. We had data visualizations to show people what the candidates were what people were talking about on the platform about the candidates and the issues. And I look at my phone, about to do that last TV hit, and it's morning here in the US, and there's a story on Gizmodo that a contractor at Facebook is accusing it of suppressing conservative content in its trending topics feed. I hand my phone over to the press person, I go, I really hope news doesn't travel the Pacific this fast. Do my last TV hit, turn around, get my butt back to DC, and then actually here to manage the fallout. We had a lot of angry senators, members of Congress, and others from the right who wanted to know what had happened and why that had happened. A month later, Brexit happens. Then Donald Trump becomes the nominee. And remember, The Economist had a cover story in September of 2016 that was about post-truth politics. And I remember looking at my colleagues being like, this is going to be a tricky thing to deal with for the 2017 French elections. We didn't even, and when we started having conversations, I remember talking to some product people, and I was like, how would we even handle this? How do you determine what's true or not? We couldn't even think about how we would possibly set something up like that. No more than 2 months later, we had our first fact-checking program. After President Trump won, the first stories were actually not about Russian interference. It was about Macedonian teenagers who were spreading fake news to make money. And it wasn't until 2017, about mid-2017, the fall of 2017 is when we actually announced that we had found the ads from the Russian Internet Research Agency on the platform. And it just became wave after wave after wave of crisis after crisis after crisis. We were trying to figure out on the fly how to find and detect and define what mis and disinformation was. We had to figure out a policy and what to call coordinated inauthentic behavior that didn't exist. That those policies did not exist. They did not, all those things had to be created. We built political and issue ad transparency work that I had to, if you want to have a really long discussion, let's try to define what a political or issue ad is. If you think it's easy, it is not by any stretch of the imagination. And then also in this period, and I gotta update this slide because it really should say 2017 or 2018 for regulatory. You did start to see regulations start to get introduced. Not just in the United States, but obviously the EU, Canada. But I think Freedom House recently said there's been 48 countries that have passed some sort of fake news law. Unfortunately, most of those are ones actually designed to potentially suppress opposition and minority voices. And while the US at the federal level has not yet seen regulation, the EU has obviously passed the Digital Services Act and Digital Marketing Act. And we are now entering that, we're kind of coming into this phase now where they're gonna have to start enforcing that regulation. And today, I believe we're moving into a different phase. I haven't quite figured out what to call it. I used to have it as decentralization, and I'm gonna go through a little bit more about what's been changing today. A little bit more history. So this is a graph that's going to be in that report that I mentioned to you. It's probably a little hard to read, but what's really interesting is that you look at that period, the one that's the most popular or has the most number of announcements. This is how much the tech platforms were publicly talking about their work around elections and with politicians. So through 2012, Alphabet, Google, YouTube were the most vocal. They were the ones that were talking about it the most, really promoting how much candidates and stuff were using the platform. You'll see MySpace has a nice little tick up there in 2008. 2008, MySpace was actually the most popular social network. And the candidates, they were doing quite a bit as well, partnerships with news orgs, stuff like that. And then it was after 2012, but particularly after 2016, where you see Facebook, now Meta's, public commentary go through the roof. And Google and YouTube is basically gone underground. It's very hard. They do some announcement. It is nowhere near as much as they used to do in the past. And now you're starting to see the platforms are talking about it more, but they're also trying not to talk about it because they know this is all very politically fraught as well. Another interesting thing, so a little bit of the main themes that I come out with in that piece. So I mentioned Alphabet and Meta are the ones who have talked about the most. Have talked the most about their work around elections. I mentioned about how Meta became the most vocal starting in 2017. The other shift that happened there after 2016 is that the commentary about how they were talking about their tech and elections work was that it shifted from, oh, look at us, this is where the candidates want to be, look at all this amazing stuff the candidates are doing on our platform, to here's how we're protecting the integrity of our platform. All of them do work around trying to help push authoritative information about voting. I'm sure a lot of you have seen reminders to register to vote. On election day, you actually get the reminders to vote, help you to find where to vote, all that. The other thing, and this has been a topic of a lot of commentary and discussion, most of the communication centers around US elections. There is very little that is happening that they're talking about of what they're doing internationally. It exists, but it's just very little compared to the US. The other interesting thing that I'm keeping an eye on amongst many others is this shift to streaming, and particularly advertising on streaming platforms. New York Times had a story on this like a week or so ago that you can do just as detailed level of micro-targeting on streaming ads and over-the-top OTT boxes and stuff than as you could on a Facebook or Google or anything like that. But those platforms have no ad transparency. We have no way to see what those ads are on that platform. And my gut is, after they saw how places like Facebook and Google and others, how like the downsides of being transparent, I don't know if they will unless there's regulation. So we've seen 8, yeah, this one, I actually should have updated this because Coinbase has actually entered the chat as well. But so we've seen most of the companies put out their announcements so far about the 2022 midterm elections. So what I did and what you can see here is you can see the companies are listed down the side, and then I tried to break out what the different topics were that they chose to focus on. This is not necessarily comprehensive of everything that they are doing, but I find it interesting of what they choose to focus on versus not focus on. So you can see there's some very popular things that everybody touches on. They all touch about how they're helping people get that authoritative info. Most of them are talking about their electoral policies. They all have policies around some sort, around everything from harassment of election officials to you can't be putting the wrong election date on the platform, stuff like that. They all talk about how they work with partners and how they're not just doing this alone. And many talk about what their policies are around political and issue ads, though here again, it's very different because some platforms like Twitter and TikTok don't allow political ads. Others like Meta do, but then they're also going to be doing like a ban the last week of the election where you can't put new ads up. But what I find interesting is what they don't talk about. So not surprisingly, TikTok's not talking about how they're combating foreign interference, which is super interesting given that Facebook just took down an op from China that they announced today that was focusing on the US midterm elections. TikTok's, and I think rightfully so, is getting a lot of scrutiny right now and a lot of questions around just their platform in general and how they work. I found it interesting that Meta did not talk about how they handle election content in terms of recommending it, but TikTok and Twitter and YouTube did. But I know for a fact Meta does. They don't, for instance, they don't recommend political groups and stuff like that, but they didn't choose to focus on that. Very few, only Meta and TikTok talk about fact-checking and talk about fact-checking programs. And the other thing that I find interesting goes back to the content creator, I put it as, which is basically talking about how politicians are using it or other influencers and stuff like that. Only really YouTube, and so YouTube's the only one that proactively said was still like, we have best practices, here's where you can go to learn how to better use the platform if you're a candidate, stuff like that. TikTok, all they really talked about was more that they were like, their whole thing is we are an entertainment platform, but we know politics exists on the platform. But if we're going to talk to politicians, it's going to be to tell them what our rules are and what they can or cannot do. It's not trying to encourage them to use the platform. And then the other thing too is only Facebook has put a dollar amount and a staff number to their work that they're doing. Nobody else is none of the other companies are talking about how much they're doing. And my gut is that's for a variety of different reasons, but one of them is none of them are going to be spending as much money as Facebook is on this, and that's probably just not going to make them look great. What else are we sort of seeing here in 2022 with all this? There's a lot of questions of how important elections are to these companies right now. New York Times reported that Mark at Meta has really shifted his focus to the Metaverse and has delegated a lot of these decisions. Even the decision around Trump will be going to Nick Clegg. And with the economic situation being what it is, with platforms trying to cut costs, cutting staff, how much are they going to continue to put resources into this integrity type of work? There's a lot of talk now also with the Twitter whistleblower of how well-resourced can even smaller companies be. Twitter's actually not that big. And doing this work is expensive. It is hard to find people. It is not easy things to do. And there's I think there's going to be this growing question of how do you grow responsibly and how do smaller platforms, how can they build integrity teams? How can they do this work? And Another one of my many affiliations, the Integrity Institute, is a nonprofit that some of my former coworkers and I started. We were the folks that worked on that civic integrity team at Meta, but we now have nearly 100 members across 20 different platforms. And one of the things we're trying to do is to help build up resources for smaller platforms to help think through how they can build their trust and safety teams and do some of this work to try to help supplement that, because not most of them can't build up as big teams as we had at Meta. There's also just a lot of questions too. You can see here about Meta cutting the responsible innovation team. I think there's a lot of questions, and this one's really personal for me, so I don't think I can be an objective, answer this objectively, but there's this real tension between where do you want to have specialists, like I was, like who very much focused on elections. I woke up all day, every day thinking about how can the platform be specifically manipulated around elections. And now you're starting to see them kind of just, because it's hard to have specialists in so many different things, like elections, COVID, climate, like abortion, all the different topics that there could be mis or disinfo on. And so they're starting to just kind of blend it all together and having it just be one team. I think that's a struggle because I worry that if somebody isn't thinking about some of these topics and being experts on them, you might miss things. But I also understand you can't necessarily have the resources to have a lot. So I think a lot of companies are trying to figure out that balance. So what else is changing? There's a lot. One is going to be how you are consuming content and how the algorithms are choosing what content to show you is changing. So, and it's changing from mostly friends and family content to what Mark is calling the discovery engine. So, because when you go on TikTok, right, and you see it, you're getting a lot of content of the topics and the types of things that they think you want to see based upon other videos that you watched. And Facebook has said they're going to start making some of those similar changes. I think that's going to bring up a lot more questions of the algorithms, how they're choosing to, what they're choosing to the inputs to those algorithms to be, who they are choosing to amplify to you or not, and what that looks like. Particularly, of course, I'm interested in political content, because even though so many of these platforms are like, people don't want to see political content in the feed, we're going to lessen it. My thing to everybody is, if you're a platform, you can try to run from politics, but you can't hide. If you're a place where people are going to be, as the elections get closer, people are going to be talking about it, and you cannot avoid having political content on your feed, no matter how much you try. And so you're better off trying to, I think, address it head on than trying to ignore it. The second thing that's changing is how the spread of content is happening is much more decentralized across many different types of platforms. So you no longer see people just kind of using the big 3 or 4. You're seeing a lot of stuff now be on, people are sharing a lot more via Messenger, and more also like more encrypted messaging apps, which make it really hard, because then from an integrity perspective, you can't see the content that they're sharing. So you have to come up with behavioral signals to try to figure out if there is nefarious activity happening or not. We're seeing a lot of mis and disinfo happening on podcasts, on radio, old-fashioned radio. One of the things that I've been really fascinated by is the fact that even though Steve Bannon has been deplatformed from many of the big social media networks, he still has a huge audience. Huge audience. And what worries me about this is that because it's in so many more places, and because the bad actors have figured out how to use the loopholes of every single platform, and they know how to like make them work together, it's much harder to detect this stuff and to combat it. I already talked about how they're using a lot more platforms. The other thing too that's really tough is as people are using more live audio and video, as well as ephemeral content. So that's like Instagram stories or snaps, right, that disappear after 24 hours. What you're starting to see is a lot more bad actors or people who know that they're probably going to get caught by the platforms being like, we'll put it up for 24 hours, then we'll take it down. So we get the hit, but we don't actually get caught. And AI and technology is not to the place yet either where it's very easy to detect in real time what is being said in live video and live audio. This has been the challenge with a lot of like the live streamings of the shootings or things of that nature, and the companies trying to detect it. They're getting better, but it's still very hard. We're also starting to see a lot more of this content. Rather than people broadcasting stuff out to everyone, it's going a lot more to one and one to few people, which again makes it much harder to detect because it is smaller groups of people and it's harder to see. I think online advertising as we know it will be totally different by the end of the 2024 election. Between Apple's privacy changes, Google's privacy changes, the questions around targeting, how people's use of the internet is different. I don't quite know what it will look like. I just know that I think it is going to be different. You're already seeing an interesting phenomenon here in 2022 where Republicans just aren't spending as much money on Facebook anymore. But we don't quite know where the money is going. I haven't quite figured out yet, is it TV? Is it moving elsewhere? Some of them are moving it elsewhere, like I mentioned, the streaming platforms, because they don't have the transparency rules. They haven't put in more restrictions around targeting, stuff like that. And so Facebook's just stopped being useful to some of these campaigns, which is going to be really interesting as we go into these next 2 years. I think gaming and the metaverse is another very interesting area. I was talking to some folks a month or so ago, and I was a little shocked. I didn't realize that the average age of a gamer is probably about 32, and 48% of them are women. And there's a lot of, I was actually talking to some folks as well, and they were like, how can we try to detect mis and disinfo on Xbox? Or like Twitch, where people are live streaming and in the chat rooms and stuff like that. How do you try to figure that stuff out? How do you try to combat it? Those are other vectors that bad actors are going into to try to find people. And then crypto and NFTs is another really fascinating area. We are starting to see the first super PACs and such and candidates accepting crypto donations. They're offering NFTs up as fundraising packages and stuff like that. This is an area I'm super interested in just for democracy worldwide, because for a lot of the democracy building organizations we work with overseas, they're working in countries where the governments don't really want them there, right? Because they're a thorn in their side. Crypto would allow them to get funding and be more undetected, but it also allows the authoritarians to get funding and also be undetected. And this is an area where I'm trying to want to do some work and research to try to see how we get ahead of that problem. All right, what are we in for the next 2 years? We're in for a lot. We have a pretty much a sure guarantee of a Supreme Court case between the Florida and Texas bills. If you are, I don't know how familiar you all are with those, but basically Texas and Florida passed laws basically saying that like Facebook shouldn't be able to censor people based on political viewpoint. The appellate, I can't remember, what's the appellate court for Florida? Do you remember, Nate? The 11th? Okay. So the 11th Circuit struck down the bill. The 5th Circuit upheld the Texas one. So that's going to be definitely going to the court. And I'll be honest, I know I hope the court rules, but I'm not quite sure. And by the way, if you think politicians don't know how technology and social media works, let me introduce you to some of these judges. January 7th, 2023, mark it on your calendars. That is the date by which Sir Nick Clegg at Facebook will be making the decision of whether or not Trump should be returned to Instagram or Facebook. I was just talking to Nate. I'll be back here in Stanford in a couple of weeks where we're going to be debating this exact topic. And I've been asking a lot of really smart people what they think about this. And it's pretty split. And frankly, I think either decision has really significant consequences of what that could unleash and what that could mean. And no matter what decision you make, you're going to have to be willing to live between those two really impossible choices and what that might do. So I'm very interested to be having those types of conversations. And then we have 2024. So 2024 is going to be the first time ever that you would not only have a US presidential election, but elections in India, Indonesia, Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and the European Parliament all in the same year. It's never happened before. I was a dork. I went back to 1950 when India had their first elections. I mapped all this stuff out. Pretty confidence rate. And most of those are going to be happening in the beginning part of the year when the US is having its primaries. These are a massive number of fronts that not just the tech companies, but civil society, the media, governments, others are going to have to be watching and paying attention to and trying to combat the very different threats that exist for election integrity online in each of these different places. And I worry we're already behind. I wish I've been banging this drum for 2-3 years now already. But not only is it going to be hard and is it going to be right for bad actors to try to exploit loopholes or places where people aren't paying attention, this could be a huge geopolitical moment for the world, depending upon who wins in these elections and what that means for probably, I think, the next decade or so of the world, and what that means for the future of the internet, of democracy. So many different things really kind of hinges on 2024. So if I've done my job, you will not be able to fall asleep tonight because you'll be having so much anxiety around all of that. Like Nate said, so I like to write on these issues. I do a weekly newsletter called Anchor Change. The Substack is right there. Please sign up if you want to. It's free. You can also follow me at Katie Harbaugh on Twitter. I tend to share a lot of different stories and research and other things that I find in this space and area. And so I think with that, we'll open up to questions.
Let me just start with that impossible question, okay, which is, knowing everything that you know and all this history that you've been a part of, suppose you're setting up a new social network today.
Yeah.
Set up the elections department for me a little bit. What should let's call it the Harbaugh personally social network. What is it that you would do sort of differently than the firms have been doing, or just in general? What do you think? Now remember, this is not a Facebook scale organization yet.
No,
right?
it's small. Yeah.
What would you do, knowing everything you know?
So first is going to be listing out all the different types of policies and making some of those decisions ahead of time before you even build it, of how you're going to handle political and issue ads, and if you're going to, so let's assume we're going to have advertising right away. How you want to, I guess what I would say at first, so there's the policies around it, but then I would also be working with the engineers who are building the platform, doing a lot of threat ideation exercises of trying to figure out how the platform could be manipulated. So I bring a bunch of smart people, but who are evil minds, right? It's my favorite role to play, because I'm like, yeah, put me in as a Russian agent, and like I get to sow distrust. To try to think about, I guess ultimately what I'm trying to figure out is how do you grow responsibly when you're building this network? And then I would also think too of like what our international expansion plan would be, and what countries we would be wanting to go into, and when they would be having elections. And how do we, I don't know when the right time would be to go into a country, depending upon where it is in its election cycle. But if I had my druthers and had my way, that would be another thing that I would look at. But the main thing would be having that combo of at least a policy person and an engineer person that can be helping and working together to think about both how the product is designed and what the policy should be.
So the flip side of that question is, what should the platforms be doing now that they're not doing? So there's the resource question that you put up on the screen, and so talk about that. But what, from, I believe there's a Washington Post column that you wrote a while ago, or
New York Times
piece, which was a clarion call, I think, to the platform to say, all right, you're not doing enough here. So what should they be doing that they're not doing?
First and foremost is more attention internationally. And I don't just mean, again, there's a lot of work that is happening, particularly on the partnership side, the policy side, all this stuff kind of my old team did. Where I don't think that there's enough is on the product side, of putting the engineering resources to build the classifiers in the different languages to try to find violating content, to be trying to figure out the new and different ways that bad actors might be trying to exploit it. I wish that they would do a bit more, especially at the senior exec level, where a lot of the decisions have to get made, of doing their own kind of version of the threat ideation exercises. You can never fully imagine exactly how things are going to unfold, but you can try to at least prepare and think through some of these tough questions. Like, I have no idea, but I would really hope that somebody has sat down in a room and is like, okay, what is it going to take for us to have to kick Bolsonaro off if something happens here between October 2nd and October 30th, they go into runoff? And I'm not sure if they have done that. And I think that that's going to be really, really important.
So in our many conversations, I've begun to appreciate, just the scale of an international elections operation. As you said, so much of the announcements, so many of the announcements, or a large share of the announcements of the platforms are focusing on the U.S. And for that matter, you look at something like political advertising revenue or spending, that's mostly in the U.S.
Correct.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But my question is there a problem with the and maybe I'm restating sort of what you were saying, but just flesh it out for me. What are the problems in taking a U.S. model, which is what it sort of infuses the thinking here, 10 minutes from where we're sitting, that so much of the focus is on U.S. elections, and then a lot on India, Brazil, and others, but they're bringing to those countries in some respects a view of elections that's based in the U.S., and we're a pretty unique.
The U.S. is the exception versus the rule of how elections are run internationally.
So expand on that.
Yeah.
What is it that what are the harms in sort of taking I don't say the harms, what are the ill-fitting aspects of the U.S. election experience for other countries?
So the U.S. is the only place that has this amount of spending that is done in elections. The U.S. is the only place that, it's one of the only places too that doesn't have like an ad blackout or any sort of media blackout. Different countries, most countries have between 72 and 24 hours. France is probably the most extreme. I think candidates can't do run any ads or anything. I think it's 3 months, 3 or 6 months ahead of time. The U.S. is the only place where we don't have we have a national level federal elections commission, but it was actually defunct in 2020. If there was any other country that had a defunct election commission like that, but that was okay because the U.S. is the only place where it's so decentralized down to the states and even the counties in how our elections work. We're also one of the only ones that has an electoral college type feature for the presidency. And so what you do see, so just the structure of U.S. elections is very different than international. You also have challenges internationally with much more corrupt electoral commissions in some countries. You have the threat of violence at the polls is a real thing that many countries have to deal with. And I remember having to sit down and think through a policy of how if somebody posted that there was violence at the polls, how do we verify that? Who do we verify that through? Because we didn't want to take it down if it was true, but it can also be used as a voter suppression tactic. One of the things we do see, though, is generally what happens in the United States does tend to spread in other countries. That you see Bolsonaro doing a lot, taking from Trump and stuff like that, and other candidates too. How they use the platforms are different. So another interesting challenge we found in India was that many people, even though Hindi is their first language, they would use Facebook in English. And so it wasn't valuable for us to just use the language they picked on the platform to help show them information. We needed to actually show it in both English and Hindi because of how people were using it. Many places, WhatsApp's more popular than Facebook. So, and in other places too, they also don't necessarily have as many laws as we have here in the United States. There are some countries that foreign funding of elections is totally fine. And we had to and that was really tough in making some decisions around political and issue ads. But on average, my team was monitoring about 200 elections a half. There's a lot of elections. There's always an election happening around the world, and you just don't hear about very many of them while they're happening. They don't tend to get a lot of attention, particularly from the global south. Don't get a lot of attention here in the Western world and in North America. And so one of the challenges the companies have is that prioritization of countries. And last story I'll share is Kofi Annan was here in California, I think it was back around 2018 time period. And I remember Simi Chakrabarty, who ran the civic integrity team at Facebook, he was like the product lead, I was the policy person. We asked the Secretary General, how did he prioritize what countries and problems to work on? He gave us kind of a non-committal answer. But that's one of those challenging questions and trade-offs that nobody wants to talk about, but it's just a fact of matter, it's truth, that the companies can't spend everywhere. But I wish we just have those conversations more out in the open. What that should look like.
Can you talk a little bit about how it was done when you were there?
Oh yeah, I'm happy, yeah. So and I'm actually trying to work on bringing some of this stuff more publicly and having more of this, but we would usually start about 1.5 years, 2 years out from an election. And we would start by doing a risk assessment. So we had worked with a lot of our researchers internally, talked to smart folks like Nate and others, and we tried to map out, okay, does that country have a history of violence in their elections in the past? How was the internet used in the past? Do they have a tradition of having foreign interference? If so, where is that interference from? Because some people, like, China maybe is paying attention to more countries, different countries than Russia is sometimes, vice versa. And so we would then go and talk to people. We would do research trips on the ground where we would talk to politicians, we talk to academics, we talk to regular voters to try to build out those risk assessments. And then from there, we would try to we kind of basically try to assign, it wasn't an actual number, but like how much of a threat the Facebook platform would be in that country and potentially be used and abused to try to help us to then stack rank the countries. And we had what we called a minimally viable program, which was the bare minimum we would do in most every place. So for instance, like the election day reminders, we pretty much would run anywhere. The only place, one of the places we couldn't run it was Russia, which was ironic. But and then we would build up resources from there.
I want to open it up to people in the room. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Let me before I just want to ask one last one as you all are thinking. And this is also needlessly provocative, which is I want to make the argument that fact checking is a fool's errand, particularly when it comes to.
I'll join you in that argument.
Well, okay, that's what I'm. Maybe it's not so provocative. Because you mentioned election violence right now, but then a lot about disinformation as being the election-related challenge. We've had years of experience now with platforms trying to regulate election-related disinformation. Is this something that obviously this problem cannot be solved. We don't even know what that would mean. But is it really even one that can be managed? I mean, is there a point at which the platforms should be throwing up their hands and saying we can't grapple with this, or is it just look, they're going to do the best they can, and the fact-checking regime is one we're going to just keep muddling through with?
I am surprised they haven't just lifted their hands and I'm done with it. I wouldn't be surprised if it still happens potentially after 2024, depending upon where resources are in the economy and everything like that. My gut, though, is that the program will always stay in place in some way, shape, or form. But what I do think that we need to stop doing is playing this whack-a-mole game that I feel like fact-checking is. And it feels like we're on the same hamster wheel over and over and over again, having the same conversations. And start to try to think about, okay, are there things we can shift of what we were doing? For instance, is there more that we can be doing in trying to push out authoritative information? One of the things I'm actually about to do with Bipartisan Policy Center, we're going to do a survey of across America, and then we're going to oversample in a couple of key states. I want to try to figure out who the most trusted messengers are of information, like around drop boxes, absentee ballots, stuff like that. Instinct says it should be the election officials, right? I'm guessing that's not what we're going to find. And I really want to answer the question, though I don't think I'll actually get an answer to it, but this is what I want, which is if Donald Trump says something, who is the person that could say opposite that would cause somebody to change their mind? And that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out that I think could maybe then start to help us to think through, okay, who do we need to engage more to get more counter speech out there? There's a lot of studies that are showing, you see what happened with Ukraine and the Russian invasion there, the pre-bunking and getting ahead of some of the false narratives that we knew that Russia was likely to be pushing into there did help, at least in Ukraine. Now, we could have a whole other conversation about what they're doing in Latin America and Africa that should scare you, and everything that they're pushing there that doesn't seem to be getting as much attention. But I do think we need to be thinking of different approaches and what it looks like. The last thing I will say to you, the whole question around, there's obviously a lot of controversy over Facebook excluding politicians from their fact-checking program. I think that that debate is framed wrong. I think the debate that we need to be having is what should the penalty be to you and the content you put up on the internet if you did get fact-checked. Because really what they're saying by politicians being exempt, they are being fact-checked. It's just they're not getting demoted. They're not getting the labels put on their content. And I think reasonable people can disagree about what should be allowed or not allowed, but we haven't yet determined what the new societal norms are of how people should be held accountable for the speech that they're putting on the internet and what right do they have of the amplification of that speech. And obviously Renee DeRessa has written a lot about that here, and I think that trying to think through to do more of that will hopefully, that in combination with the fact checking, maybe will at least help us to get a little bit more control on the problem.
Sounds good. All right, so let's start over here.
Hi, thank you so
Oh,
much
I'm
for
sorry.
sharing with us today. I'm Divya, and I'm a student studying both political science and computer science. One of the questions I had for you in that original kind of table you showed of social media companies and the type of announcements they were having,
Yep.
as well as my personal experience with TikTok. I'm unfortunately a very avid user, and I see a lot of Google ads that are actually about like trust, safety, and learning about how to identify information. Who do you think should be the person responsible or the company responsible for spreading that type of message? Like, is it right for Google to be spreading those messages on TikTok? Is it right for private and nonprofit companies to be buying ads, or should TikTok be doing that themselves?
It's super interesting that Google is buying the ads on TikTok. It doesn't surprise me though. I think as many people as we can get to be pushing this information out and trying to do it. This is part of the reason I also want to do that study around who's the trusted messenger. But frankly, as many people as possible, because everybody trusts different folks of what they are doing. And I think what is important is that they do, and I know that Google does this and most of the platforms do, that they're not just making all the policies and making those decisions inside their own bubbles, and that they're working with researchers and other groups who are studying like the best way to get that information out to people. But they've got the resources, they should put some of that money back into it to try to help people figure that out.
I should say here at Stanford, we ran in 2020 the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, which did a lot of work on trying to push out these messages. We actually, through the design school here, and they're continuing to do this work, developed a lot of videos that then were placed next to items on Facebook, and also in the voting information center, so that, for example, if there was something about absentee balloting that came on your feed, that some of these videos we produced would be there to try to be an authoritative source of information. Next question. Yeah. Speak loudly. So
first, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to ask about something you mentioned earlier about ephemeral messaging and encrypted messages. I think this touches on the idea of anonymity. Do you view anonymity as mutually having a mutual relationship with malicious content? And how should we treat anonymity in order to prevent malicious content from spreading?
Anonymity is a really hard question because in many places overseas, people need to be anonymous because it really can be a life or death situation if their name gets out and a government that does not like them could bring harm to them. But it does bring a challenge then of trying to determine that intent. Also the question around like pages and advertising. There's some stuff that Facebook started to do while I was still there of if your page got to a certain size, you needed to have some I think they have a way that you can you'll verify with Facebook that you're a real person, but they won't make your name publicly available if you can prove that you live in a certain country or you have a certain situation around that. But you're tapping into one of the many things I call impossible trade-offs that these platforms have to find and have to try to find that right balance of how far do you go of trying to prevent bad things from happening, but then how many unintended consequences come from that in terms of trying to combat any of these these other activities that could be happening. So I don't have the perfect answer for you, but I think there does need to be some anonymity that is allowed on these platforms. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. You talked mainly about what you thought the company should do, and I'd love to hear you talk more about what, if anything, you think governments should be doing.
Yeah.
And in a way that is to say, no, there's a possible trade-off where you're making it better without creating the harm of
Yeah.
governments regulating speech. And also whether you think, at least looking at the United States, the government need to move fast enough to have a credible policy that keeps up with the technology.
The speed at which governments move is definitely a challenge. Like, a lot of the bills that you see, I'm like, they're regulating the old Facebook. They're not regulating where it's going and where the algorithms are going and stuff like that, which is a challenge. I'm right now in the transparency train with Nate in terms of legislation. I still don't think we fully have defined the scope of the problem, nor have we fully defined what success looks like with this. And so having more transparency and data from the companies will be very important. That's also tough to do, as Nate also knows more better than I do, of that challenge. The other thing, too, that I think will be a challenge is, and we're starting to see some of this come out more with the Twitter whistleblower, and then some Facebook engineers recently were, I don't know if it was deposed in a court case. There's usually no single person who knows where all the data is at these platforms. These are big behemoth companies that have had teams that have built up over the years, all different sorts of stacks and databases. And I was oftentimes shocked, like it was really hard to draw a straight line between, okay, this problem's happening, why is this problem happening? And it's really hard to trace it to, sometimes you're like, oh, this engineer over here launched this test experiment and didn't realize it was gonna have all these adverse effects. So I think that transparency is gonna be really important. Governments also have to really start thinking about how they're actually going to enforce this regulation. So in Europe, I keep joking, Europe's the dog that caught the regulatory car, because now they passed the law, but now they're realizing they don't necessarily have all the expertise that they need to actually be able to understand and make sure that what the tech companies are going to be telling them is actually everything that is happening. And so they're trying to think through, how do they build up the expertise, how do they hire people, and also they're not getting very big budgets to do it. And so I think governments are going to have to be making some of those decisions too, of how much funding and expertise they put into actually trying to enforce some of this regulation. And then they're going to be finding themselves in a lot of the tough spots the platforms we're in, of how hard it is to make some of these decisions really quickly as problems are happening and things of that nature, that I won't lie, I'll probably have a little bit of schadenfreude while I am watching it happen.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Tanvi. Thank you so much for being here. I was just curious, in your experience, how you've seen different policies shape out in like a traditional social networking kind of platform, like the Facebooks, Twitters, versus like a Google or a Microsoft, and what do you think each other can learn from each of their policies, if at all there is any kind of cross-pollination there?
So I definitely think there's cross-pollination, and different platforms learn from the others. Every platform is pretty unique, so I don't think we should expect that every platform is going to have the exact same policies or enforcement on many of these things. What I think that, so there's so many different aspects to this. So I definitely think they learned from one another. I also think too that they make different political decisions about their policies. So political ads is a great example, and how much are they willing to stand scrutiny that can come from some of these tougher decisions around that. I also think too that the platforms also learn how hard it is to enforce some of these things, and so they may see some of their other platforms have struggles doing that, and they may make different decisions as they are doing that. So yeah, I think that's it. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Sarah. Thanks so much for being here. I wanted to ask a question not on government regulation, but on government messaging.
Yeah.
And kind of how to break through into what you were talking about in terms of like who is a trusted voice. So like over the last year, I think everyone knows we saw the Biden admin talk to TikTok and like Instagram influencers to try to disseminate correct information about Russia, Ukraine, Inflation Reduction Act, student debt relief, and all of that. And I hope that we're kind of successful with that, but there are also obviously downsides to that approach as well. And in some cases, it's like kind of low-hanging fruit. That's like the first time that the government has really tried that out, I think. So is that moving in the right direction, or are there other approaches?
Of using influencers and messengers and like that?
Yeah, kind of get at that, like who is a trusted voice and how do we like use trusted voices to disseminate correct information?
Yeah. So the struggle, I think, with having just the government do it is when you look at how that scales globally, again. Both how it scales globally and where does it start to move into propaganda and other kind of problematic content. The other thing too, and this is going to be fascinating with TikTok, because TikTok has said not only are they not allowing political ads, but you can't do political paid influencer partnerships. So these paid influencer partnerships are really, really hard to detect, to track, to know if they're doing it, because you're basically trusting the influencer to be honest and being like, I am being paid for this. But in politics, we've had celebrities endorsing candidates for a very long period of time, and they don't get paid for that. And one of the things I'm a little worried about is, like, are we actually going to be sowing more distrust, and people aren't going to quite know what to do? Oh, are they being paid? Are they not being paid? Do they just really like this person, don't like this person? So I think we should keep an eye on it. I think it's good that the government and others are trying to find different voices to get to different people. But I do think we need to make sure that it's not just one, it shouldn't just be the private sector, it shouldn't just be government, it should be kind of a whole of society approach.
Hi, sorry, my name is
Oh,
Ash.
yeah.
I was kind of intrigued about what you said about the platform, like smaller platforms having a big problem with this because of just the scale of the problem. And I took a disinformation class last semester, and it was really difficult I learned it was difficult for researchers, not employees of the companies, to research this problem because there's no way to effectively get this data. So could you talk a little bit about what the kind of decisions were in Facebook to not really offer a developer portal, things like that? I know academics love Twitter's API and things like that, and Reddit's to a certain extent, but why aren't all platforms kind of subscribing to a kind of open, transparent way where academic researchers can really study the problem and kind of help them out with this scale?
Yeah. So that could be a whole other seminar. So I'm going to try to, and you should chime in too if I get any of the stuff wrong. So first, on the Facebook side, there's a challenge because some content on Facebook is friends only. It's not all public. So trying to figure out how to get the data in a privacy safe way ended up being a much bigger challenge than I think anybody thought that it was going to be and what that should look like. Just the pure fact of trying to figure, I think, even how to deliver the data in a safe way, do you have to have people inside the companies? Can you give it and remember, the Cambridge Analytica scars run deep.
Can you explain for that?
Oh, the Cambridge Analytica?
That actually is a question we just got on Zoom, which is, how do you prevent another Cambridge Analytica? I mean, for some of these folks, this is, they were in junior high school when Cambridge Analytica.
I have to remember.
Yeah, I mean, because you were there
Oh,
when it
God.
all happened. As briefly as you can, and then this is the last.
So back in 2010 or 2011, Facebook launched something called Open Graph. And if you remember, some websites still have it, the login with Facebook button that you could do. Well, back then when you logged in with Facebook, amongst the permissions that you could give people was access to your friends. It was your likes and interests, but also access to your friends' data, some of your friends' data as well. A researcher at Cambridge was running a series of studies to get people to fill out, were they filling out quizzes or something, or surveys and stuff like that? Logging with Facebook, he was getting all this data, and he then, it somehow got into the hands of a political marketing firm called Cambridge Analytica, and they were using that to try to do voter modeling to target voters in both Brexit and the Trump campaign used them and others. If you talk to Republicans and the Trump campaign, they say the data wasn't very good. But in March of 2018, so 7 years later from when Open Graph, and 5 years after it had been shut down, The Guardian and the New York Times ran a big story calling it a data breach. Given that all the furor and everything that was coming out of the Trump winning, the Russian ads, everything like that, it was another wave of crisis that came in March of 2018. And so Facebook is really, going back to your question around data, how do we prevent another Cambridge Analytica? How do you decide who the researchers are, who should get access to the content? How do you police that once you have that done? Another thing too is when you are more transparent, it is going to show more of your flaws. And if you're the only company that is being transparent about some stuff, it means you're sometimes going to get more attention. And the other ones can sometimes just skirt underneath the radar because people aren't finding it. And it's a reality that they have to kind of think about in trade-off with this. I think most of the companies would want to be more transparent, but this is where there's a bit of a standoff between government and the companies, because the companies want some level of protection so that they don't get fully blamed if another Cambridge Analytica-like thing happens. And that's been one where some of the tensions have been in actually getting regulation.
It's always good to end on the note of academic access to data.
Yeah. Nate trained me well.
Thank you, Katie. This was an absolutely wonderful way to start off our term. Thank you so much for coming. I want to just note the rest of the fall seminar series. So next week, Josh Tucker from NYU and their Center for Social Media and Political Participation will be here talking about some work that he's done on YouTube. And then Tim Wang from Substack will be here the following week. Joan Donovan will be here for a special Thursday edition of our seminar series on October 13th. Rasmus Pleiss-Nielsen from Oxford on October 18th. Mason Sun, one of our own postdocs here, and Chenya Jia will both be presenting after that, as well as Alexander Kuzarawi from the Program of Platform Regulation, Chris Hufnagel from UC Berkeley, Elgene Camp from Indiana University, and then our own Ron Robertson here from the Stanford Internet Observatory. So it's a jam-packed.
That's a good list.
I hope you all come here every week. And then Karen Nershi at the bottom, also from the Stanford Internet Observatory, rounds it out on December 6th. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your presentation. Absolutely perfect. That was exactly